Hello, my name is James Brubaker, and welcome to the Writer's Desk Pedagogy in Practice. Today, the title of this program is Teaching at the Crossroads of Trauma and Place. We have three wonderful panelists who I'll be introducing to you in just a moment. Before I introduce them to you, as this is a panel about place, thought it was worth mentioning that all three of this panelists either currently live or have spent a great deal of time in Oklahoma. So there is a shared place kind of at the heart of a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So I will just introduce each of our panelists here, and then we'll get to the conversation. Rilla Askew received a 2009 Arts and Letters Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her first novel, The Mercy Seat, was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, Boston Globe Notable Book, and received the Oklahoma Book Award and the Western Heritage Award in 1998. Her novel about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, Firing Beulah, received the American Book Award. Her recent books include a novel, Prize for the Fire, and a new collection of short stories, The Hungry and the Haunted. She teaches at the University of Oklahoma. Next up, we've got Brandon Hobson. He's the author of the forthcoming novel, The Devil is a Southpaw, The Removed, and Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, as well as other books. His stories have appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, and elsewhere. He's an associate professor at New Mexico State University and also mentors at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And finally, we've got Constance E. Squires, who is the author of 3 novels and a collection of short stories. Her novels have been awarded the Oklahoma Book Award, named a Great American Rock and Roll Novel by Electric Literature in 2018, and nominated for the National Book Award in 2025. Squires holds a PhD in English and teaches creative writing at the University of Central Oklahoma. So welcome, and thank all three of you for joining us here today. We're going to be sort of focusing this conversation on pedagogy and teaching, but since all three of you have written a lot dealing with place and trauma, I would like to kind of start by asking each of you just to talk a little bit about how you've approached place and trauma in your own stories and novels. Rilla, would you like to start us off, please?
Yes, thank you. And I'm very, very pleased to be here. And thanks for inviting us to do this, James. So I've written about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I wrote about it. I did the research on what happened, and that very much covered up history in the state of Oklahoma. It happened in 1921 and was really, the history of it and the story of it was really suppressed in the dominant culture. And I first learned about it in the early 1990s and began researching it before I had archives on the internet, before when I had to go, travel back. I lived in New York then, travel back to Oklahoma and go through the library microfilm, newspaper files and so forth. So my career as a novelist really began with trauma and place. And though I lived in New York at that time, I was teaching at Brooklyn College, and that's how I happened to first learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre, was reading a biography of Richard Wright, which I was teaching my students Richard Wright's work, but I didn't know his biography. And then when I read that and it mentioned the Tulsa Race Massacre, which they didn't call a massacre then, they called it a riot. So that's where it began. And I've written about white settlers coming into Indian Territory in the late 1800s. I've written about the Great Depression, which was a very traumatic time and very place specific. I wrote about the Okies who did not go to California, but who stayed home and suffered through those Dust Bowl days here. I've written about immigration. Oklahoma was one of the first states to pass an anti-immigration law. One of the most, it was the first most stringent. It was before Alabama. It was before Arizona passed similar state laws. So and that novel is also about the trauma of what happens when we pass laws that target specific populations. So that's how I, as a writer, I have engaged with trauma. And this, I've written a nonfiction book called Notes from a Wounded Place, Most American Notes from a Wounded Place, because this place is so wounded. But this spreads out, this is the whole nation. And so we'll talk specifically about Oklahoma, of course, because that's where we come from, but as writers, but the trauma exists everywhere on this continent. And so I think the things that we speak about can be extrapolated for teachers and, you know, emerging writers everywhere. That's it for me.
All right, great, thanks. Um, Brandon, could I ask you to talk a little bit about your work next, please?
Sure. Yeah. So my last three books are set in Oklahoma. But I've written about in terms of place, the foster care system with Where the Dead Sit Talking, and specifically how Native kids were not so much anymore, but were treated in the foster care system in Oklahoma. Also, The Removed has some references to the Trail of Tears, which is a major historical event. And the current one has to do a little bit more with juvenile incarceration in Oklahoma. So, so all those certainly are very very strong traumatic, events that I hope use place and the strangeness of Oklahoma in interesting ways. So,
all right, thank you. Yeah. And then Constance, to tell us a little bit about how your work has incorporated place and trauma.
Yeah. So my three novels and my short story collection have a lot to do with Oklahoma, and deal with trauma in different ways. Then it kind of goes from the specific to the broader. My first one is more about family trauma. It's about an Army family stationed in Germany during the Cold War, and it ends up in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And then there's a lot of material in my work that concerns addiction. So that's kind of the personal trauma with addiction in my second novel, and also in my short stories. And then my recent novel, Low April Sun, is centered on the Oklahoma City bombing in April 19th, 1995, and it's actually the real time of the story is about 20 years afterward in 2015. So that structure by default just sort of meant that I was talking not so much about the day of the event or the immediate the immediate fallout, so much as the long-term trauma of in the lives of my characters, about how they were dealing with the impact of the bombing during those years. So it was really very much set in the heart of Oklahoma, and yeah, trauma went from being something I never really keyed on as a subject to being what it was all about, So.
All right, thank you all. Let's go ahead and dive into talking about some teaching and pedagogy. I want to start with just sort of kind of a basic question to kind of get a baseline with regards to how developing students think about place in their work. What are your experiences with students at different levels of development in terms of how invested they are and just thinking about place in their writing?
That they tend not to have any interest in it initially, and I remember being that way too. I remember that I was really concerned with the psychology of my characters, and Oklahoma seemed like really a boring place, and so it seemed like a unfortunate that I, would like to put it somewhere else if I could. So I really get it with how they are about it. But yeah, I try to talk to them about how there are parallel lines with the historical narrative and the literary narrative, and that we really have so much opportunity because there are parts of the country that are absolutely filled in. That the literary narrative has been very much covered by many wonderful writers for a long time, whereas our part of the country, not so much. And so we can be those voices. We can really tell the story of this place in a way that hasn't been told. And so it sometimes I like to start, if it's an intro class, by having them list everything they hate about Oklahoma, which really gets things going. People could just sort of like, yeah, and I put it all on the board, and they're like, all the things that suck about this place, and then we pivot, right? And then there's that a wonderful poem by Bob Hickok called "A Primer," and it's about Michigan. And it kind of does the same thing. It begins with the sort of, I get to say this about it because I'm from here. And then by the end of it, it's kind of a love letter to the place. And so, we just sort of start talking in that way. And, but it's kind of a long road. So,
yeah. Sorry, Connie, are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would agree with that too. I wonder if it's in terms of a younger sort of generation are less interested in literary realism and more interested in sort of genre, or at least my students seem to be very interested in genre. And in terms of thinking about sci-fi, they want to think about, they like the other world sort of as place rather than a much more sort of realism. And so one of the things that I guess I do this with some exercises too, but we talk about like in Scott Momaday, for example, has written. I know Connie and Rilla know this as well, but he has written a lot of just sort of very place-driven sort of poems, and writing about nature outside, and whether it's by using the wind or by using trees or birds in unusual ways or interesting ways, and sort of having conversations about what's magical about that. For me, just nature and weather itself, atmosphere can be, to me, as interesting and magical as a lot of sci-fi or fantasy stuff that they seem to be really interested in. So I try to always go in and read, someone who's doing something really. The writer Stephen Millhauser is one, and that's a little bit more. He's more of an East Coast. A lot of his stories are set, of course, in Connecticut. But he uses place and I think in description in really interesting ways. So I try to, have some conversations about just how the natural world is as interesting in place as more genre stuff. But my hope is that younger students, I don't know if they're reading, maybe they're not reading as much literary realism as maybe we did, the four of us, or I don't know but I agree, they're not, even here in New Mexico. Of course, we have in the MFA program, we have students that come from all over, but there's not a huge focus on it, and I find it really strange.
I do think it's the time we're living in, that reality is pretty traumatic just right outside the window. I mean, this is an entirely traumatized generation from coming through COVID, and the young people that we're teaching. But I also think it's at least for my students, it's that they get so much of their narrative from film and video games and television, and that's where they love story, and so that's where their hunger goes, and they don't. So I think you're right that they don't read realism, and when I think about who are the young writers coming up, and where that blossoming is coming from, I have a feeling as we move on into the next years, there may be more of a return to that as young people find ways to couple bearing witness to what we're living through right now with their storytelling and with the things that are fantastical. And I say to my students, that to set, your speculative fiction in Okemah, Oklahoma still works. If it's someplace you can see, you don't have to name it that, but if it's someplace you can see and touch and feel and taste, and you can make the reader do that rather than some TV set that you have in your mind, or somebody else's idea of what's a fantastical world, and then give it those twists, that they get kind of excited about that when they begin to realize that they can use what they already have deep access to and couple it with their imagination.
Yeah, I wonder if, to kind of follow up on this thread, if what sort of teaching place in this sort of, these sort of fantastical sci-fi or fantasy settings might look like, and if there is a way, or you've had experience sort of teaching setting in this way, where like having students think about the settings, these non-real settings, if there is a way to sort of parallel that to real world places and sort of help them think about the physical place around them, even if they're writing in a fantasy world. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. That is sort of the way I handle it, because I have a ton of a fantasy and sci-fi, and it just sort of comes down to the body. If you can get them rooted in the body, it's how you use POV, so that whether we're in a space station or in a forest with fairies or whatever, if we sense that we're inside a consciousness that's inside a body that feels the branches brushing their skin, or the cold of the atmosphere, or which is basic creative writing, just the concrete details. It just, if you can get them to where they're doing that, it seems to level it up. It takes that green screen quality out of the writing, and I tell them, when a reader says they're into it, like they're in a story, it almost always means that they have physically responded to something with their body, that they felt something in their stomach or their heart, or they whatever, and so if they can do that, then it can feel real. I don't know if that helps.
I agree with that. And I'm totally all in on sci-fi or genre or more fantastical settings. In fact, I even encourage, if my students are really interested in that, I really encourage that. But it feels too like even if it's an imaginative setting, there's not a whole lot of observation, it feels like, right? So, so it's almost that they need to, draw a map, or, or write a short description of place first, before they start drafting, especially if it's taking place in a fictional, play. Yeah, in the Removed, I did that, and part of the novel, I had this sort of purgatory, weird, otherworldly section, right? That I really just tried to make it as real as possible, but yet still have kind of this, I tried, I don't know how successful it was, but to really sort of, just make it my own sort of area, and try to be as descriptive as possible with that, because I feel like there's less emphasis, for students writing so much on description of whatever that place is, and they're focused more on, you know, whether that's plot or characterization, or they're more interested in describing other characters, which is also good, but less in place for some reason. And I think, you know, that's something that we should be pushing more, certainly.
And of course we know this, but I just have to say it, which is that we just have to give them the examples, and when I give them is the removed of the writers who are doing this. And so, because if they want to write speculative fiction, and then I give them that novel to read, or actually, truthfully, excerpts from that novel to read, and some of your short stories as well, Brandon, which are non-realist, and they can spend a long time talking about what all of that means, but also giving them the example of where that rich physical sensory world that you all are talking about, and the characterization, and also Connie just speaking in terms of point of view, how vital that is. And so many of my students, because frankly they don't read a great deal of fiction, and they get their storytelling from a lot of times from film and media that does not have point of view. So you're not inside the character that way. You're looking at it from the outside, and so their point of view stays slippery because they're not in the body the way Constance was. I've never called you Constance. I'm sorry. I see it on the screen here. This is Connie is describing. So yeah, and I also think so. Yeah, giving if we want to open up a place for our students to write about trauma and place. I mean, we're not going to impose it on them, of course, but they come to us with that already, whether they're conscious of it or not. And I think that this is true everywhere. It's certainly true with this generation, and I think it's true. It's true in our era. There's no way for it not to be. They came of age in the midst of a global pandemic, and not to mention all kinds of other things that have happened in this world, and climate change, and all of that, and yet I think at least my students don't have enough experience of storytelling that respects their own experience of where they come from, who their family is, how they got to where they are, and all of those things. And because they don't have that, they don't think that they can write about that. They don't think it's worthy of being written about. And so I can say that, but that's not going to make any difference. They have to read it. And, you know, that's that's key for them to read it, read someone, and then go, oh, yes, this, my grandma used to say that all the time. And then something opens for them. And they're still not going to write realism for the most part. And that's good. They got to write what they got to write.
Mm-hmm. I think it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about here is students reading, and I think that is a big part of how we sort of start getting them thinking about place. And to kind of follow Rilla's idea there, I think, yeah, a lot of students kind of have these ideas about trauma and place in them. They're probably coming into our classrooms, you know, like with these ideas in them, but not necessarily sure how to write them, or maybe they're sort of writing them but aren't fully aware that they're writing it. So when you sort of see students sort of coming in with this sort of predilection to think about, write about place and trauma, or, you know, maybe you're not seeing it in their work necessarily, but there's the hint of it in there. You know, what kinds of assignments, activities, conversations do you have, either revolving around reading or writing exercises? You know, what do you do to kind of like help draw this out of students in the appropriate circumstances? You know, like you said, you can't really impose, hey, you have to write about place. But how do you kind of tap into that energy when you sort of see it as being an important part of, you know, something that a student is working on?
As for me, it depends on the level of the students. So I teach undergraduates primarily, although I do teach some graduates, and so I teach intro classes and teach young people who are just trying it out, and we teach poetry and creative nonfiction as well. And I do give them those exercises I use some of the exercises from Tell It Slant about memory, first memory and so forth, and those work just as well for fiction as they do for creative nonfiction. And having someone mentioned observing. So again, young we do it ourselves, but certainly young people experience their world through devices, through screens, and we don't have the habit of looking up and looking out. And so just the practice of that, just asking them to look around the room and absolutely describe what is in this room in some way that a reader can experience it. So those are just some of the things that I do. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does depend on what they're writing and the level of it. But you know, they don't so much think about place. But another thing that seems to have changed is that it used to be that they didn't write about place because they were interested in the inside of the character. But now, and I think it has to do with streaming and all that, that they are even less interested in the inside of the character. They really just want to present scenes in a real cinematic way where you're just aware of the movement of the characters, not the place and not the inside of the character. And that is really challenging. So I always start with saying, fiction is the only art form that can give you the inside and the outside of a character at the same time. And if you are not availing yourself of that, why write fiction? Use both legs, right? So pulling them back into the consciousness seems really important. And there's that John Gardner exercise. I think it's in the back of one of his books that's about write something from the point of view of a man who's looking at the side of a barn, who just found out his son died in World War I, but don't tell us that his son just died in World War I, but we need to know it by the end of the scene. That the sort of thing that makes you think about the metaphors that different characters use to describe things that open up their history for you. So like a person that describes something hot as cookies coming out of the oven is a very different person than describes something as hot as the carburetor on the side of a Harley, right? I mean, you automatically are in two different heads by the words they use to describe heat. So just getting granular with them about metaphor, and that is a way in. I don't know, that seems to help because it makes them kind of aware of like a set of tools they didn't really know they had to use.
I'm curious because a lot of we're the panel is talking about place and trauma, and I think in all of your work there's this very clear connection between really awful things that have happened to characters or cultures that are being explored through fiction. And in my experience with a lot of my students, they're very eager a lot of the time to write about trauma, but not necessarily about place. Is have any of you sort of had experience sort of bridging that gap, sort of asking students to think about, if you're thinking about this trauma, this sort of emotionally difficult outcome of past events, or something more current on maybe a personal level. Have any of you had experience kind of bridging that trauma that students are already writing about a lot to conversations of place and setting?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have, just in the conversations that happen in the classroom, drawn that connection. I do it I speak about trauma and place, speaking historically about Oklahoma. And that's something that I think about a lot. It's what I've written a lot. And so, but I don't think about tying that to their personal trauma, which is what they're more interested in. And yet I think they're not separable. And so I think that I feel myself challenged to consciously make that connection in a way that I don't think I have. I think again, writing about it and thinking about historical trauma and transgenerational trauma, I do talk about that. And for my students to understand that they suffer transgenerational trauma in many ways, many of them do. And to recognize what that is. And that is also tied to place. But not necessarily specifically statewide, but it's to what their story is. And many of them don't know their story. They don't know what has happened in the past, all the forces that have come together to make them them. and I try again more often in my poetry and creative nonfiction rather than fiction, but it really should work both ways to challenge them to do that. To look outward, to look inward, and to look back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really try to recommend that it's so easy. All you have to do is turn on the news or pull it up on your phone. You can't avoid it, but there's so much going every single day. There's something now that is just absolutely horrible that's happening. It might be there's a school shooting every other week, or there's a church shooting, or Connie writing about this historic event, this bombing that is really ripe for writing fiction about. Even you have a lot of options there in terms of what to write about. And I agree. I feel like some of my students too are more sort of self-focused on they just want to write about just their own specific trauma. But I'm thinking also of that book. There's a book called Black Water by Joyce Carol Oates. It was a novel that came out in the early 90s, and I believe it was based on Senator. I think he's referred to just as the senator, if I'm correct. It's been a long time, but there's that. I think it's based on Ted Kennedy, where he drove. He drove a woman, and they drove a car into a river or something.
Chappaquiddick.
Yeah. And
Joe Kopechne, I think her name was.
Yes, and he survived, but she passed away. Or whatever. I think Joyce Carol Oates took that story and really kind of did her own thing with it. But that it's such it's such a really interesting exercise in thinking about looking at just kind of a news story that we would see something like that every single day on the news, and playing with it and thinking about trauma rather than not that students shouldn't write about domestic violence or something. That's the trauma from that too, but there are a lot of options out there, and I guess I really try to get them to think about the more historical things. And again, we have Rilla's written about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Connie's written about the Oklahoma City bombing. These are huge events in terms of place. And so, what is it that? Because I guarantee you, every state has many sort of events that are happening that I guess I wish they were thinking more about that, like using it, because they are so screen invested all the time, that we can really use that in the classroom, and thinking about, we shouldn't be coming to class thinking, well, I guess I'm not really sure what to write about because nothing significant has happened to me. Students say that nothing significant has happened to me. Yes, but what now? Haven't you observed something, or maybe it hasn't? But start researching now, and because it's real interesting. It's real easy, excuse me, to find interviews now with people who have just witnessed somebody. They've been at a concert and there's been a mass shooting, or whatever that event is. Watching an airplane. It was this last night. There was a small airplane crash or something in Florida, and they were interviewing people who were really shaken by this. And I mean, there's just a lot going on, and so I think those present as really interesting ways to think about beginning a story.
I think in my classes where I give assignments, I have better luck with this because I can create these assignments. I can one of the stories that I use, Connie has a really wonderful second person story called No Tourist. I use it every semester in my intro class because it's such a terrific example of why ever even use second person. So I use it relative to just to craft, just to point of view. But and it's also about recovery, or actually it's not really about recovery, it's about addiction. But then when I tell the students, that library that she's in, that's that library right down up on the South Oval there. They'll go, "Oh, I knew it. I could just see, Bazell Library in my mind when I was reading that." And so all these things sort of work together by what I choose to assign them to read and assign them to write. It's where I get into my advanced classes, which are, and by the time they're there, many of them have had this underpinning coming up with the ways that I teach, but many of them have not. They've been with other instructors and so forth. And so in those workshops, I mean, they bring in whatever they bring in. I'm not giving them an assignment. So if they bring in, mermaids, that's what we're talking about, And so it's in terms of our program, which is primarily an undergraduate program, we do have a graduate and a master's degree with creative writing emphasis. Making our courses, working really hard to make our courses sequential, and I work with my fellow writers in helping to basically grow the students so you can begin there, and if they're not really interested in this pursuit, they find out in that intro class. They just sort of go someplace else, and that I think is one thing that is helpful, is to give the grounding, which I really do primarily through craft, just the traditional, plot, narrative, character, sensory details, point of view, all the things that we look at.
Yeah, one thing that I like to point out with them is that when we talk about setting, everyone automatically just thinks place, but setting is place and time. And while they have no sense that they're in an interesting place, they do know they are in an interesting time. We all know that. We all know we're in an interesting time, and that's setting too, And so sometimes that's a backdoor into talking about, well, okay, the time is interesting. Where are you in this time? And that can lead into availing themselves of the space they're in a little more. Because we all know we're in a traumatic historical moment. So
I wonder just how much of sort of, earlier, Connie was talking about getting students sort of think about sort of like the, their physical sort of place in the world around them, and sort of, if you can get a reaction sort of in the body, that's doing something. And Brandon was just talking a little bit about, research, like watching interviews with people after sort of traumatic events and whatnot. Have you encountered students who are interested or excited about the idea of doing research for their writing, especially if it relates to, place, whether or setting in general, time or place? Or have you noticed resistance to that? Like, and if we're talking about place, we're talking about trauma, a lot of it is historical trauma. It seems like research would be a very important piece of that puzzle. I'm curious if you've had experience with students doing research or being resistant to research.
I would just say I have taught a course in writing historical fiction. That's where they love to do the research. And so occasionally I do in my general classes have students who want to write historical fiction and or speculative historical fiction as well. They love doing the research and talking a great deal about how we do that, about how you join that research and make it seamless with point of view and story and narrative and all that works really well. But yes, I think they think creativity will be diminished by research. So I have had students that they really are resistant to it in their regular fiction when they just bring in a story, and I say, that didn't happen in 1921. That actually could not have happened until 1957 because we didn't even have, and so yeah, there's a little resistance there.
I got to interject. Just this last semester, I had a student write way back around the summer of love in the 1980s, and I almost died. Sorry to let you get back to this wonderful conversation you're all having.
Yeah. I haven't had too many people really focus on research and unless they really are writing historical fiction, and then they seem to almost want to do that first, sort of immerse in that. I seem to always have someone in the class whose primary form of critique is that kind of fact checking. I think maybe they're just not comfortable critiquing the writing yet, and so they'll be like, well, actually, and it's helpful to have that person to the person who will get the get those little Wikipedia entry type elements of facts straight. But I don't know, it hasn't really been a big feature in my workshops, really.
I feel like I haven't had a whole lot of success with motivating students to research much, but I've never taught like a historical fiction class. But where I haven't, I've taught some form and technique classes, and where I do think they will research more is when I really stress the assignment having to do with obsession. And I feel like obsession is a really interesting topic for someone to write about. And I know, and James, I've talked here about your work a little bit. Is that you've written a lot about sort of obsessive, and I'm going to say here with music, especially catalogs, those kinds of things that. I mean, I guess for me, it's getting students to think, what is it that you just absolutely love, and it might be music, or it might be video games or something, whatever that is. How can you use obsession in some way to, and that's the only way that I've really had luck with them really going back and bringing all these notes or that before they've even started writing the story. Because just when, just in a regular workshop, if I tend to say, well, you should research this a little bit more. This character showing signs, this elderly person is showing signs of dementia. But I feel like you're not quite, giving us enough information there. And there's a little bit of resistance. And so I would love to have some better strategies in terms of how to do that in just general workshop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I think in my experience with young writers is that it's one of the reasons I really love teaching undergrads, because they're really anxious to learn, and they're anxious to, they don't really know yet. They don't think, they sort of know that they don't know. And I've taught in a number of MFA programs before I was here at the University of Oklahoma. And so I think that sometimes young people they feel they fear that their creativity is going to be robbed of them if they have to go find out some facts from someone else's input, and or even reading other writers. And I don't think that's really uncommon. So sometimes, so in courses that are designed to give students assignments, I think it works better. And so I actually love workshop, and I teach workshop. Just the traditional, MFA format. But I also really like designed courses where students find themselves challenged, and then they become excited about it once they experience it. And it's in the abstract they don't like it, but I think once they experience it, both in terms of their own work and seeing the work that comes into the workshop, and also just reading the writers that we give them to read.
Mm-hmm.
One last thing. Oh, I was just going to say, sort of coming back to trauma and place, and I think we've covered that pretty well. I will say that I find my students to be they often are writing about personal trauma. And so it's really important to create what they feel like is a safe space. I find that the other students are really respectful of that. And so I don't know if I'm just really fortunate, or if it's indeed this generation, which is what it feels like to me, that they are very cognizant of being respectful of one another's choices and pain and trauma. And so I think making sure that we have a safe space where that we can say trauma does also belong to place, and it does also belong to us, and it's not just inside families, and it's not just inside your personal self. And so the younger my students are, the closer they are to high school age, the less they understand that. But you know what James Baldwin said, you think your pain is the only pain in the world, and then you begin to read. And so that's what I have to try to provide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great sort of area to kind of zoom in on here as we get to close to the end of our time, because anytime we are talking about trauma in writing, whether it's in readings that we've assigned students or in the writing that they're bringing to class with them, it can lead to difficult conversations. So what are some of the ways that you all kind of work to provide that safe space for students to share their work, or to even just have those conversations about some more difficult kind of texts?
It definitely seems to have a lot to do with how we model the discourse, how we model talking about it, and also how we model vulnerability, combined with rigor and respect, and sort of what we are able to say about the text that we assign, or that we or if we talk about our own work. It seems to really help. And every class is so different, there's really no single way to do it. It depends on the personalities in the room. But it really is a fine line, because on the one hand, you want a sort of rigor, so where people are going to talk with some shoot fairly straight about the craft, but also be sensitive about the emotions. And if you're not careful, you'll have a case where the sensitivity to the subject matter makes it impossible for people to talk about the things that are wrong in the writing, and then sort of vice versa. And so that it's kind of tricky. But I think we just have to practice it. And definitely, I mean, what Rilla was saying, how much more practiced they are at sensitivity and empathy. They really have a whole different mindset and training than we did, right? I mean, I think we came up in workshops that were blood sport, right? I mean, like the idea of worrying about anybody's feelings is like, I'm still getting used to it, right? It's like, oh yeah, right, okay, we're going to talk about our feelings. So, but it's great. I mean, it's really great. I feel like I learned from them a lot of times about that sort of thing. Yeah, I really do try to, that saying, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader, no laughter, all that stuff. It's very true, that we just basically have to risk ourselves in the writing, or it will be boring for the reader, So there's a kind of bravery involved.
Yeah. I really just early on, I just try to create with the first day, especially just, a really fun, safe environment that I don't, I don't do things that sort of old-fashioned way at all anymore. I'm just not enough of a hard ass, I guess, to be able to pull it off or something. I'm not very good at it. So and for the most part, the MFA students, they sort of get an understanding because I really have kind of a sincere conversation, in that about, yeah, there are some things that could be really, really difficult that we might be talking about here, but if it gets uncomfortable, then we can absolutely will stop. But the main thing here is looking at, and I think getting away from the fear of writing and the fear of coming to workshop, and I think that can, excuse the term, but cripple paralyze the writer in many ways. And it's hard enough to get, for many students, it feels like, to just get the work down on the page, much less to share it, and we're going to have a conversation about it. So, I just try to really, there's that book that came out a few years ago called The Anti-Racist Workshop, right? Or the yeah, that I think has some really good ideas in that book, and most of it is, yes, we're just going to create a safe space. I believe writing should be very pleasurable. It's not often, right? But why are we why are we all love to read, and we all love to write, and there's something about that, and part of the creation of that really makes us feel very human. And so we have to kind of find that, whatever that is, and maybe it has to do with the topic, which might be something not at all traumatic. That's fine too. But yeah, that's for me. I'm just trying to create that sort of open dialogue, and make it as safe as possible.
Good vibes.
Yeah.
Good vibes indeed. We're almost out of time. Does anybody have any closing brief thoughts they would like to share on our way out?
I guess I would just affirm for myself, really, as a teacher, that all of these things really, really matter. And the, the affirmation of the fact that their lives as they are deserve respect, for them to be writing out of their lives as they are. And so I think that, and helping them recognize that, because they have the creativity, they have the storytelling, they have the stories in their mind, the imagination. They don't always have, in my case with my undergrads, they don't always have craft to know how to put it on the page yet. And so I do emphasize craft a lot, but also just not only me respecting them, but saying aloud, respect your own story, your own place, your own personal trauma, and the historical trauma that has all come to shape this place or these places where you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. I thank you. Or did anyone else have any last thoughts? Or we Right. Well, thank you all so much, Rilla, Brandon, and Connie, for taking some time to share your thoughts on this today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to AWP and the Writers Desk Pedagogy and Practice for having us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
James.
Thank you all.
Thanks.